Okay, we will begin the next panel now. The original plan was to have Kathy Robb as the moderator. She had a conflict, and so instead we're pleased to have as the moderator Carter Strickland Jr. Because Carter was a late add, there was an error in the program, and the bio is Carter Strickland Sr. So we know that Carter has a terrific dad, but this particular Carter Strickland is the Deputy Commissioner for Sustainability at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. He oversees DEP's environmental planning, analysis, permitting, and enforcement programs. And before joining DEP, he was the Senior Policy Advisor for Air and Water with the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. Before that, he was at the Rutgers Environmental Law Clinic and an Assistant Attorney General in New York, and most importantly, is an alumnus of Columbia Law School.
Thank you, Mike. We have a great panel, and we have some time to make up. So I'm going to ask, first of all, our panelists to keep it to 10 minutes, if possible. Can't do it. Okay, well, everybody else will. And we'll try.
Talk faster.
They talk very fast. We're New Yorkers here. And then we'll try to leave some time at the end for comments. My role as chief timemaker, or timekeeper, rather. I will say you've got a great panel. You know their bios. They're illustrious. Jim Tierney, Assistant Commissioner of Water Resources for DEC. Phyllis Weinmark, Chief of the Water and General Law Branch at the Office of Regional Counsel, Region 2. Guy Watson, who's standing in for Nancy Wittenberg, who's the Chief of the Bureau of Recycling and Planning, and Walter Mugden, now Director of the Emergency and Remedial Response Division, and he's held pretty much every other role at Region 2. You all know him. Collectively, I totaled it up, and we have over 100 years of experience with these four on the panel. And if you count my graduation from Duke Law School in 1965, you have another 40 years. So without further ado, we'll hear from Jim Tierney.
Thanks, Carter. Oh yeah. Oh no, I'm just gonna talk. Good. I read the New York Times article about how PowerPoint's making everybody dumb, so I'm going to try and stay away from it today. My name's Jim Tierney. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for Water Resources in New York. I work with Carter a lot. Carter and I have an extensive relationship and on all sorts of matters, and I really appreciate all the things that New York City is doing right now, and it's quite a job they have. Well, one thing, just basically, I just always like to say this at the start for the people who are unaffiliated with the Clean Water Act. There's something I like to call the Clean Water Act machine, and it is an endless do loop, and it just keeps coming at you. First is you classify waters for their uses. You set water quality standards to make the water good for their use, fishable, swimmable, drinkable, shellfish, what have you. Then you have to draft permits. And you put controls out there, whatever it is, to put those, to make those waters actually achieve water quality standards. And then you assess it, and then you do it again, and again, and again, and again. And as you find more problems, it gives you more things to do. People hear about the rise of pharmaceuticals and personal care products, estrogenic effects of a lot of the chemicals, the 80,000 chemicals that Judith Enck mentioned. And this keeps coming at you as we learn more. And so we are, in the trenches trying to get this done and working with many hard-pressed industries, but also particularly hard-pressed municipalities in these efforts to try and find a way to get our water clean and to keep completing the tasks that the Clean Water Act puts in front of us. Now, there's just hot off the presses the National Water Program guidance from EPA. I just commend this to your reading if you're interested, because this is the first year EPA's policymakers are really in charge of this document. This kind of shows you where they're going and what they want to do. And it's a much more aggressive team. It's a much more innovative team. I spent a lot of time suing EPA when I was at the Attorney General's office for not doing their job. Now EPA is doing their job and then some. And they have quite a task because the national floor of standards really is in the basement. And they have to get it back up to the first floor, maybe the second floor of the house sometime soon. And I'm proud to say in New York that most of our programs are well beyond the national minimum. on program after program. And EPA is doing a number of interesting things where they're saying, okay, you hear about restoring water quality on a watershed basis, protecting coastal and ocean resources, protect wetlands. We know why you want to protect the wetland if you're involved in environmental law, but this watershed approach is interesting. First generation of environmental law was you build infrastructure, right? And then you do permits and you have programs and everybody's in their classic silos and it goes forward. The second generation is now we rebuild that infrastructure. It's all falling apart. These things last for 30 years and then they break down. You have to rebuild them. And then you have to do rebuilds in a way that comply with water quality standards that are frequently heightened or things that we just hadn't thought about before. So the whole rebuild program for Long Island Sound, where we're putting nitrogen treatment at the cost of billions of dollars on every major wastewater treatment plant discharging into Long Island Sound. We're not necessarily done yet. The Clean Water Act will keep coming back and saying, have you done enough? And require more. It's also in this watershed approach is this ecosystem approach. Article 14 of the ECL passed a few years, ecosystem-based management. And really, if you want to learn the best approach to ecosystem-based management and the watershed approach, it's right here in New York State. It's the New York City Watershed Program, where you have a discrete area, about 2,000 square miles, where you've kind of come at it from every conceivable angle of where's a pollutant source on sediment, pathogens, and phosphorus, and how do you turn that off? And that, those sources still keep showing up. The work is still very interesting and innovative, and we keep finding those things and working with our partners at DEP and EPA and others, Department of Health, to try and turn those spigots of pollution off to protect over the long term, I hope, the unfiltered status of that water supply. Just think about it, $10 billion to build a filtration plant, probably $300 million to operate it year in, year out. Huge carbon footprint associated with that. Why would we waste this resource when we have it there? But things always come and bite you, right? So there's a plant up there that makes pharmaceuticals. It's a big one. And the U.S. Geological Survey just found the highest level of pharmaceuticals in any outfall from a wastewater discharge plant that this plant flows to. It's about 1,000 times higher than anything they've seen in the entire country. And so we're going after that, right? It's another source. We're going to try and figure out what to do. It's not necessarily regulatory. It's not a Clean Water Act standard for these pharmaceuticals, except if you get above, a safe drinking water, Clean Water Act standard for it. But how do we go about addressing that? These things keep up and they keep going. The other thing on the watershed approach is the interest of the federal government in these watershed basins, the Great Lakes, $475 million this year alone. Oh my God, what you can do with that money. Lake Champlain is getting a lot more money. Long Island Sound, Chesapeake Bay, and Puget Sound and the like. So funds are really being focused into these watershed approaches around the country, many of which are in New York. I just want to say one thing. Only $800,000 to the Hudson River, New York, New Jersey estuary. We're getting dissed, all right? And New York and New Jersey and the city doesn't like being dissed, and we're going to try and address that. But let's talk about the Chesapeake Bay example. I think this is where they're really going. There's legislation coming out from Senator Cardin on how imposing a whole additional level of stringent controls and accountability requirements on Chesapeake Bay. Kind of where people who are pushing the envelope forward and national legislation are focused. How can we do that for Long Island Sound, Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound? Those bills have some things that are doozies in it and cost an enormous amount of money. The Chesapeake Bay program, which is in New York is the Chemung Susquehanna. It's a small piece of the state of New York, about 13%, about 620,000 people, 630,000 people. They're saying here, on all wastewater flow, 90% of limit of technology. Limit of technology is quite stringent. It's quite expensive, big carbon footprint. And these are poor communities. On anything else, any other conceivable source of pollution from a farm to a roadside ditch to a sidewalk and a street gutter, 65 of everything everywhere needs to be retrofitted. That's probably more than what's being done in the New York City watershed. The New York City watershed program, much smaller area, cost about $1.5 billion to implement. We don't know what the cost will be in the Chesapeake Bay program, but it's something, and it's coming. And I got sort of like, a fire and brimstone letter from the regional administrator of EPA Region 3 saying, this is coming, Tyranny. This is coming, Grannis. Watch out. So we're seeing a great interest from EPA in going forward. Anybody who has a CSO program, represents cities, municipalities, and like, I have 200 cities under long-term consent orders in the state of New York for clean water infrastructure, a lot of them very expensive. EPA is getting involved in this in a big way. Kansas City, 700,000 people, $2.5 billion consent order just entered into. Oswego, a community with 10,000 people, EPA's press release noted that it's an $87 billion fix to their combined sewer overflow system. And so these are big things. And the other thing I wanted to say while I have time, and I don't know how much more I have left, is that there's a big interest right now in these CSO programs and the like in green infrastructure. Think of every way that a crafty landscape architect could slow water down, spread it out, and soak it in a beautiful way. I know Walter had a great presentation on this. Think of what that can do for our cities if we're crafty enough to go after our polluted runoff problems and our combined sewer overflow problems in a way that reinvigorates and beautifies our community. You have to spend the money, right? We're going to make you spend the money. Why not spend it in a way that's beautiful and serves the local community? And we're doing a number of that with innovative orders right now. And just a quick roundup, we've updated everything. People who hear about Albany say, oh, nothing's getting done. Boy, are we active. And we're doing a lot of enforcement. We've updated our combined animal feeding operations permit this year. It's a whole technical manual and program that's been done. Construction activity general permit's been updated and done. Municipal separate storm sewer systems. Think of Puget Sound gets in the Gulf oil problem, right? Problem of oil in the Gulf. Puget Sound gets the equivalent of the Exxon Valdez every 2 years just from polluted runoff. The drip, 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 drip of oil over the landscape that's picked up by stormwaters and washed into Puget Sound. That's the Washington State Department of Ecology's report. And so this is all going on. I'm glad to be available for any questions on it, but I have a little more time. And I just want to start with one other thing. Yeah, okay. One other thing while I'm there is that while we have a lot of work to do, while we have garbage islands in the Pacific Ocean the size of Texas, these plastics that are out there floating in marine debris, while we have that level of oil washing off the shores, while we have problems with pathogens that are closing beaches, carbonic acid, do you believe what's going to happen? We're not going to have coral reefs in 50 years? No coral reefs. They're going to dissolve. The carbonic acid from the CO2 dissolving in the water will melt the shellfish. Think of that. Think of that. That blows me away. And what so at the same time we have all these problems, we also have to remember that basic sanitation, taking care of, basically keeping human waste out of human water, humanly used water, is the single biggest thing that has increased the longevity of humanity. Human wastes carry human disease. The Center for Disease Control did a study saying that if you take all of medical science, all surgery, all pharmaceuticals, all antibiotics, everything else you got, it's on par with what basic sanitation did for the longevity and the health of humanity. We got that here. It's starting to fall apart, and we got to make sure we maintain it with proper funding going forward. Thank you very much.
I don't. Can you do it? We'll now hear from Phyllis Feinmark.
Ms. Mike here? I don't know how to get it maybe just escape or something. Oh, okay, there it is. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Okay, yeah, I got it. And then I press F5. And it didn't work.
Hold on. There you go.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, thanks. I sort of feel like I'm at the photo op at the Oscars. I should hold up my trophy. Thank you, and welcome to my biennial Rapanos presentation. It seems that, like Sisyphus, I'm doomed to roll down this particular huge boulder roll it up the hill, only to have it roll back down. As you remember, that was Zeus's punishment for Sisyphus's hubris. He was sentenced to an eternity of frustration. So if you just switch the rock for Rapanos, I know how he felt. Anyway, I'd like to start off by finding out how to switch the slides. There we go. With this poster, as a reminder that, as many people have mentioned, this year marks the 40th anniversary of the creation of EPA. This was a poster done by Walt Kelly, the creator of the comic strip Pogo. Just as a matter of curiosity, does anyone besides me remember Pogo? Yeah, just like... Thank God. The quote was a parody of a message sent in 1813 from U.S. Navy Commodore Oliver Perry to Army General William Henry Harrison after the Battle of Lake Erie. I know this because I looked it up at 5 o'clock this morning, stating, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Although Kelly first used this quote interestingly to defend his strips dealing with McCarthyism, the final version is this 1970 anti-pollution poster for Earth Day. Pogo Possum and his friends lived in Okefenokee Swamp in Florida. Looking at the poster, I caught myself wondering if Pogo's home would be jurisdictional today. I think so. Anyway, it's sobering that 40 years have passed and we're still only taking baby steps to protect us from us. As an aside, although I would like to take credit for finding this poster, I can't. My husband, Steve, found it when he was putting together my PowerPoint. Steve is a whiz at PowerPoint, and I am most definitely not. So I give him all my information, and he makes it pretty. Now, I used to be embarrassed, and Jim, it's great minds. This is great minds. I used to be embarrassed that I was such a Luddite until I came across this article in the New York Times a month ago. Familiar, right? Here. So, now the enemy is PowerPoint. It's not us, thank God. The accompanying article discussed the U.S. military's frustrations with the limitations of utilizing PowerPoint to aid in developing strategy for Afghanistan. They've been using graphics like this, which, with no disrespect intended, reminds me a lot, actually, of Rapanos. And it really is a battlefield. I've got the psychic wounds to prove it. So anyway, the best minds in the military have come to admit that it's dangerous to use PowerPoint because it can create the illusion of understanding and the illusion of control. And indeed, some problems in the world are not bulletizable. So with that in mind, I'll start my PowerPoint. Let's start out with the Clean Water Act itself. The goal of the Clean Water Act, as everyone knows by now, I'm sure, is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. We regulate discharges of any pollutant, including dredged or filled material, which is Section 404, into navigable waters, which is code for waters of the United States. It's important to remember in this context that we're not just talking about Section 404. We're talking about 402, NIPDES, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, TIMDLs, 311, which is oil spills and enforcement actions. Jurisdictional waters, or waters of the U.S., are determined jointly by the Corps of Engineers and EPA. You can find extensive background and original documentation. I have these websites included in the package you got. This is the Corps of Engineers website. This is the EPA website. And let's move on to the Supreme Court decision. In 2006, the Supreme Court decided Rapanos and its companion case, Carabel. Briefly, its decision was that when addressing jurisdiction, we have to evaluate when a tributary or wetland qualifies as a water of the United States. Scalia wrote the decision for the plurality. Important to remember this. 4 justices made this decision, and they found, ironically, 4 categories of waters are jurisdictional. Justice Kennedy concurred in the judgment with his own reasoning, so that was just 1 justice. Any type of water can be jurisdictional if it meets certain functional requirements, and 4 justices dissented. They endorsed a broader definition of jurisdictional, focusing on the fact of hydrologic connection. I'm going to do something a little bit different this time. Instead of discussing the decision in detail, I'm going to walk you through how the Corps and EPA have implemented the many decisions of the Court. Needless to say, the extreme division of the Court led to some confusion. For instance, whose opinion applies? Either Scalia or Kennedy or undecided. It's it's always confusing. You have to remember where you are at any given time. The confusion entailed in implementing Rapanos is further illustrated by quotes from the decision itself. I like this one where Scalia says, thus, establishing that wetlands such as those at the Rapanos and Carabel sites are covered by the Act requires two findings. First, that the adjacent channel contains the water of the United States, and second, that the wetland has a continuous surface connection with that water, making it difficult to determine where the water ends and the wetland begins. But then we have Kennedy saying, the plurality is wrong to suggest that wetlands are indistinguishable from waters to which they bear a surface connection, even if the precise boundary may be imprecise. What? A bog or a swamp is different from a river. The question is what circumstances permit a bog, swamp, or other non-navigable wetland to constitute a navigable water. Well, this led to some thoughts on Rapanos. For instance, this judge in the Northern District of Alabama compared it to making sausage, or actually didn't because it would excessively demean sausage makers. So, on to implementation. In response to the Rapanos decision, the Corps and EPA issued joint guidance on June 5, 2007, with an accompanying 60-page instructional guidebook. The astonishing thing is that we have over 80 pages based on about 3 paragraphs that the Corps and EPA gleaned from the decision. Continues to be joint technical guidance for making Section 404 jurisdictional determinations. It was, although originally issued in 2007, it was revised, very, very minor revisions in 2008, and it identifies those waters over which agencies will assert jurisdiction categorically as well as on a case-by-case basis using the reasoning of the Rapanos decision. The revision, I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. I'll just talk faster. That's what I said. Walter and I have this ongoing thing. I think I can talk faster than him, but we'll decide. We've never been on the same panel before, so this should be fun. The summary of the Scalia test: 4 categories of jurisdictional waters. There are traditional navigable waters, TNWs, wetlands adjacent to TNWs, and adjacent means bordering, contiguous, or neighboring. Look it up. Relatively permanent waters that are tributaries of the TNWs, there are RPWs, and wetlands abutting. We had adjacent, now we have abutting. RPWs having a continuous surface connection to the RPW. Identifying TNWs, which is our first category. Those are waters that are tidal, or waters used or susceptible of use in interstate or foreign commerce, and we look at prior court determinations, prior court decisions, evidences of navigability. Carter, just go away. I figure I have till 3 o'clock. So we're going to go through some pictures. Here we go. Traditional navigable waters. I can't be managed. Ask Eric. TNWs are in. So much to our relief, Lake Champlain is still jurisdictional. The Caribbean Sea, we still got control, but then it gets tricky. What about the Msw River in Puerto Rico? It's susceptible to navigation, but do we have evidence of use? Indeed we do. In 1932, we found that bags of charcoal were ferried across the Rio Grande de Luisa, and there's a coconut grove in the background, in case you were wondering. The Catskill Creek, yes, documented canoe use is available. On to Category 2. Adjacent, remember, bordering, contiguous, or neighboring. The revised Rapanos guidance clarifies that a wetland is adjacent if it has unbroken hydrologic connection to jurisdictional waters or is separated from those waters by a berm or similar feature, or if it is in reasonably close proximity to a jurisdictional water, still jurisdictional. This is a wetland separated from a water of the United States by a man-made barrier. If you want to be cool, you say water of the United States as WOS or WOTUS. In Region 2, where we say Speedies and Nipties, we say WOTUS, waters of the United States. Salt marshes in Peconic Bay are wetlands adjacent to tidal waters. This is a case at Bavoni Landfill in St. Thomas, a tidal mangrove wetlands, still jurisdictional. On to Category 3. Relatively permanent standing or continuously flowing bodies of water, waters that are seasonally continuous in flow, and perennial non-navigable tributaries to TMWs. Still jurisdictional. Relatively permanent waters. This is an unnamed perennial tributary in the Catskills, and we're on to Category 4. I'm sure you're getting the idea by now. It's not easy. Wetlands with a continuous surface connection to bodies that are waters of the United States in their own right, so that there is no clear demarcation between waters and wetlands. So continuous surface connection. This is work in wetlands directly adjacent to a perennial tributary that flows indirectly into the Ashokan Reservoir. Unauthorized stream protection, that riprap on the side, on a large valuable trout stream in Delaware County that flows directly to the Delaware River. This is an intermittent tributary, but it does flow at least 3 months per year, so it is jurisdictional. We are done with Scalia. That was the plurality decision, now the summary of the Kennedy test. Waters with a significant nexus, and by the way, that was the easy part. Significant nexus is the hard part. We have to find waters to be jurisdictional if they meet certain functional requirements, but he did not give us a real good guideline about what he meant, so it's based more on speculation than anything. We think that a significant nexus exists where a water or wetland, either alone or in combination with a similarly situated land in the region, and it significantly affects the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the TNW. And where would we use the significant nexus analysis? Where there are non-navigable tributaries to TNWs, where there are wetlands adjacent to non-navigable tributaries, where there are wetlands adjacent to but that do not directly abut RPW. And those would all require a significant nexus analysis, which would be an assessment of the flow characteristics, a consideration of the hydrologic factors, and a consideration of the ecological factors. But this is what we're talking about, people. All of these factors could be used in a consideration of significant nexus. Are there TIMDLs? Is there the potential to transform nutrients? Potential to export organic carbon? This determination, I'm going to run through some pictures. This determination can run 100 pages and take 6 months. It means that to regulate wetlands these days, if they're not obvious, is a nightmare. This is the summary. You're lucky if you can identify relevant TMWs. One more minute, Cart. You can check for jurisdiction under Scalia, a water, a wetland, and then you can check for the significant nexus. I wanted to talk just 1 minute about hopes for the future, and that is that on April 21st of this year, Representative Oberstar of Minnesota introduced America's Commitment to Clean Water Act. Yes, the acronym is AQUA. And as he puts it, to reaffirm the ability of the Clean Water Act to protect the nation's waters, including wetlands. The legislation is in response to the 2001 Swank decision, that's the Solid Waste Agency of Northern Cook County dealing with isolated wetlands, as well as the 2006 Rapanos decision. Oberstar hopes to restore the common understanding of the scope of the Clean Water Act as it existed in 2001, and to provide also much-needed certainty to the regulated community, and I might add, the regulators as well. The legislation is most notable. It's in your package. Take a look at it because it's really interesting. It expands on the constitutional basis of the Clean Water Act Rapanos jurisdiction. The Act currently draws the totality of its authority from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. That's how we regulate waters of the United States. Oberstar seeks to expand the constitutional foundation, invoking not only interstate commerce, but also the treaty authority, saying that it is necessary and proper means of implementing treaties to which the U.S. is a party, such as those protecting fish, birds, and wildlife, and the authority to protect territory or other property belonging to the U.S., such as parkland, refuge land, and other land under federal ownership, and the waters encompassed by that land. So that was in direct response to the Swank decision, where the Supreme Court stated that in the Clean Water Act, Congress had intended to authorize regulation only of channels of commerce. This bill relies on 3 sources of authority, not just commerce, and therein lies the hope that it will allow the federal regulatory authorities to recapture what we feel we've lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you for making up time while and you did a great job.
Negative time.
Right, exactly.
I ended before I even started.
That's right, that's right. Now I don't know where the conference is. There we go. That's still right. You know, it's interesting, I think, to compare that to what's happened in the wake of Kelo, another decision that's been controversial, where there was a big reform movement among states and in state legislatures. Same thing hasn't happened in wetlands, and in fact, I think Michigan's trying to give back because of resources. Okay, well, that's good.
They're going to hold it for the time being. Apparently, EPA decided to take some of the functions back to save them some money.
So it's a big resource issues for the state. Without further ado, Walter Mugden. Oh, I'm sorry, Guy Watson.
I don't know what he was going to talk about. What was he going to do? Okay. No, he doesn't know what I was going to. Sure. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about paper or plastic, basically. Actually, the three of the many issues affecting solid waste management in New Jersey at this time I want to talk about very briefly. One, the interplay between, the relationship between the state's Global Warming Response Act and solid waste management. To talk about the effect of the Oneida Herkimer decision on solid waste management in the state going forward, and finally to talk very briefly about the E-Waste Management Act, and again going forward in terms of producer responsibility and how this is kind of a big change that's going on. Actually, New Jersey, in terms of looking at recycling as a corollary to energy usage, has been going on for a long, long time. And in fact, the original policy document that kind of guided the beginnings of recycling policy in the state started back in the late 70s as a response to the Arab oil embargo in the mid-70s, and for those having to wait in line for gasoline. Anybody, I guess, in the audience that's over the age of about 45 might remember. Otherwise, you could do what I did. Well, no, I'm over 45, but what I did last night was go on Wikipedia, of course, and found out all I needed to know about it. At the time, in the 70s, New Jersey had a very large recycling infrastructure. We had something like 13 paper mills, the largest glass-producing industry in the country, a couple of steel mills. In fact, the ferrous scrap processing facilities in New Jersey at the time were producing about 20% of all of the domestic capacity for ferrous scrap, used by all steel mills in the United States. Also many steel foundries and other ferrous and non-ferrous foundries. And the supply disruptions of oil in the mid-70s was, amongst many other things, a really serious challenge to the manufacturing capability of the state, and it was understood at the time that there was a direct relationship between the use of raw materials and, of course, energy inputs and then the product outputs. And in New Jersey, since we don't have a lot of forests that we are cutting down to create paper, all of the paper was coming from recycled materials. All of the glass was coming from either recycled glass or it was coming from, sand that was naturally found in the state. All of the ferrous scrap going to the steel mills was coming from recycled materials. And what the state was looking at was a way to try to reduce energy usage in the manufacturing sector, to kind of try to protect that manufacturing sector at the time from what could be some very serious supply disruptions. So then Governor Byrne formed the New Jersey Recycling Forum to look at what the state's appropriate response in terms of recycling should be. Because at that time, all of the material that was being collected under commercial, voluntary programs. The New Jersey Recycling Forum published a book, pamphlet, policy document, I guess, called Recycling in the 80s, and it recommended that the state, for energy conservation purposes in the manufacturing sector, pursue a voluntary policy of trying to achieve a 25% municipal solid waste recycling rate. And of course, focusing on various paper grades, focusing on glass containers, focusing on steel cans, other ferrous scrap, as well as, at that time there really wasn't much in the way of plastic. So really, and in that report, they identified the energy savings that would accrue to these industries if we were to pursue this policy. And, shift 30 or so more years later, now we're talking about, the incorporating solid waste management into an overall policy of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Well, we already did that years ago. But the legislature passed the Global Warming Response Act that is putting New Jersey on a path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, using 2000, I believe, or 2005 as the base, to reduce them by so much by 2020, and then by like 80% by 2050. The solid waste component of that is to achieve a 70% recycling rate for MSW materials by 2020, and then to push towards a zero waste policy by the year 2050. Now, right now, New Jersey is at about a 38% MSW recycling rate. So just getting to our old 20-year-old statutory mandate of 50% is going to be difficult enough. But going forward and trying to achieve a 70% and then to achieve a zero waste policy is certainly going to be difficult, but I won't be around to worry about it, so somebody else can figure that out. But there's been a lot of talk about zero waste, and basically, what it means. And the big challenge, of course, is government up to this point has not really ever intruded into the marketplace of what kind of packaging is used, and what kind of materials you actually put in products, but we're going to have to lay an umbrella over that at some point, and it will require legislative action that will say everything you produce in terms of packaging or your product is going to have to be either fully compostable, where the methane would be captured and the compost would be reused again, the nutrients returned to the soil, or recycled X number of times or reused X number of times. Or simply, being able, compost, anything but either disposed of through landfill or through energy recovery. That's what our goal is. So that's the incorporation, or how we're looking at recycling and its response to climate change. One last thing I want to say on that is, even though recycling is currently looked at in terms of its potential for greenhouse gas emissions, vis-a-vis manufacturing energy savings and transportation energy savings as well. And it can be looked at as the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Of course, it is way behind transportation and power generation. But looked at another way, if you look at not only just the production of products, but then the transportation of those products, et cetera, there's a model out there that says that the manufacture and the transportation of all the stuff that we use is really more like 40% of all of the emissions that are greenhouse gas emissions that are generated. And so, again, overlaying on top of that, in terms of zero waste, we should already also be looking at an overall reduction in the amount of solid waste that we produce per capita, because by far we produce more waste per capita than any other nation on earth. The EPA certainly recognizes that, and they've established goals for per capita waste generation and trying to ratchet that down. The difficulty is, we might achieve that in 2008 and 2009 because of the recession, but waste generation really does track along with economic activity, or at least it has historically. We probably at some point are going to have to break that chain so that irrespective of economic activity, and hopefully the economic activity is growth, that it doesn't necessarily translate into ever higher amounts of waste. Enough about that. Oneida Herkimer. Just when the state had gotten used to a market situation in solid waste where we could not rely on waste flow because of the 1994 Carbone decision that said that waste is just like any other commodity and states cannot do anything that would hinder interstate commerce of this commodity. Then, and we get used to that. In New Jersey at the time, we had about almost $2 billion worth of public debt had gone into newly built either transfer stations, energy recovery facilities, or landfills. And a lot of that debt then became stranded from the standpoint that our tipping fees were not market-based. They were well above market, and we literally overnight, after the Carbone and then the Atlantic Coast decision, which nailed it for New Jersey, we went from an average tipping fee in the state for disposal of $90-something a ton down to $60 a ton. Well, that $30 was the debt component. So all of that debt basically became stranded. Then Governor Whitman said, we will not let any of these authorities go belly up. They will honor their commitments, or somebody will honor their debt commitments, because the ripple effect of having several utilities authorities go bankrupt onto the rest of the public Oh, my God. I'm going to make this really fast. On to the rest of the public entities that want to borrow money would be disastrous. So the state, over the course from 97 to 2010, has put up about $500 million in debt payments to assist these counties. Then, just as we're getting to the tail end of that, then Oneida Herkimer comes along and says, no, as long as it's a public entity that is flowing waste to a public facility, the effects on interstate commerce are negligible. The public good is served by that, so go ahead and do it. Now, what that means going forward is that perhaps then what we can do, since we've taken care of a lot of that stranded debt, maybe these utilities authorities then can start investing in more advanced composting systems and other environmental projects that we have related to solid waste that were not being done because of the problem with debt. Finally, the E-Waste Management Act recognizes for the first time that in many respects what industry produces as goods become waste. The handling of that waste becomes an unfunded mandate on government. The nexus of that, I think, started back around 2000. There was a Product Stewardship Institute brought together a number of the states to talk about, what are we going to do about e-waste? We finally reached a consensus that, that manufacturers had to step up and take care of this. New Jersey is one of, as of yesterday, 22 states plus New York City which have adopted e-waste legislation requiring the manufacturers to take sole financial and environmental responsibility over the products that they produce. So beginning for New Jersey at least, beginning on January 1st, 2011, manufacturers will, based on their market share, current market share, have the obligation to take care of those materials from either TVs, PCs, et cetera, consumer electronics. The last point I want to make about that is that if you look at the voluntary system right now, and even though all 21 counties in New Jersey and several hundred towns are currently collecting e-waste at special events, we're only collecting about 0.8 pounds per capita last year under a voluntary system. If we look at what we anticipate under a mandatory system, the manufacturers are going to be responsible for about 6 pounds per capita beginning next year. And they're going to have to either use the existing infrastructure of collection, enter the marketplace, buy that material, or set up their own collection infrastructure and get the material and their obligation that way. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. That's very interesting.
Next, Walter Mugden.
Talks almost as fast as you.
No, I don't even.
So, Superfund. Some of you have heard some of this at an update I did in January at the New York Bar Association. I'm sorry, but it's only 4 months, and Superfund doesn't move that quickly. So not that much has changed. Region 2 accounts for about 1/4 of all the newly listed sites on the national priorities list over the last several years. The sites in general that we've been putting on the list are bigger. They're more complex. They're what we call mega sites. It's not that we haven't had mega sites in the past. Think Hudson River, think Passaic River, think Onondaga Lake. Those 3 sites alone account for probably $3 to $4 billion worth of cleanup, or perhaps more. But the sites that we have recently added to the national priorities list are also very, very large sites. In New Jersey, Raritan Bay Slag. In New York, the Gowanus Canal, Newtown Creek, and more recently, Dewey Lowful and Black River. Some of these are proposed, some of them are finalized. This is set against a situation where, just like everybody else, there is a limit to the funds that are available. Historically, Superfund sites, about 70% of all cleanup work was being done and paid for by the responsible parties. In the last few years, that has dropped to about 50 to 60%. So that's a worrisome trend for the fund, which pays for the remaining cleanup sites. Fund lead, as we call them, sites have been facing a very, very stringent limit on the amount of federal funding available and state funding available. States, of course, have to pay 10% of the cost of a fund lead cleanup. Uncle Sam pays 90%. In 2008, of the 26 sites around the country that were ready to have a cleanup started, that's on-the-ground construction started, there was only enough funding to start 10 of those 26. The other 16 simply had to wait. In 2009, we would have been at 0. There would have been enough money for only 0 new sites to be started, but for the fact that the stimulus bill in April of '09 generated about $600 million additional dollars for the Superfund program. That allowed us to start every site that was ready to start. But that means that those sites have to continue to be paid for year after year for as long as they go on until they are cleaned up. Because once we start a site, continuing the cleanup becomes our highest priority with the available funds. So this year, 2010, we probably can only start 1 or 2 sites, and next year we may be able to start again 0 sites. So we're in a bind as we're listing more complex and bigger sites. That's a problem. Have we made progress in the program? Absolutely. Of 1,600 NPL sites nationwide since the beginning of the program, over 2/3 have already had their construction completed. However, that's the good news. The bad news is that the remaining 1/3 include many of the most complicated and most costly to finish up. Negotiations for cleanups with PRPs have slowed down in the last decade, slowed down from an average of about 197 days for the negotiation to be completed to an average more recently of about 300+ days. So there's a new policy that came out in September of '09 urging us to accelerate that. And so if you are representing PRPs, do not be surprised if Eric's staff and mine start to impose what you think are unreasonable deadlines on the negotiations. And I've encouraged my staff to not engage in the long iteration on negotiating a scope of work or whatever, and to try and bring it to a conclusion with just a couple of back and forths instead of 5 or 6 or 7. In by region and across the country, there's a great deal of attention now to what is called green remediation. Cleanups are inherently a green thing, but they have a footprint of their own, an environmental footprint of their own. They can be made greener or less so. We have a very strong policy in Region 2 that was enunciated in April of '09 and updated in April 10. And it doesn't only advise that we do the right thing, it actually insists that we do the right thing. And some of those right things are going to cost a little bit more. So we insist, for example, that all electricity purchased at a Superfund site in a cleanup be, to the maximum extent possible, renewably generated. And we use a lot of electricity, use it for pump and treats. That's a huge amount of electricity that gets spent over many, many years. So we are simply now insisting that that be purchased wherever possible from renewably generated sources if it can't be made on site. We are doing work, particularly in the Caribbean jurisdictions, to try and find ways to encourage renewable energy generation on old waste sites. In Puerto Rico, for example, we're working with the Commonwealth government to look at a whole series of landfills that either have been closed or are to be closed, and some of them are being closed under EPA administrative orders. These are, in our judgment and that of our colleagues, ripe for the installation of solar farms. And there's increasingly now people are turning to landfills, which otherwise are just useless space, where the cap has to be kept mowed forever and ever, and you can't really build anything except for maybe a golf course on it. But a solar farm installation is quite possible. Of course, down in the Caribbean jurisdictions, they have very, very predictable and very high rates of insolation, meaning how much sun they get. So we are looking forward to the prospect of encouraging solar installations down there. In partnership with EPA, the Department of Energy is doing a generic feasibility study that indicates how much energy you could get out of certain sizes of landfills, looking at the most attractive ones down there to start this on. And we're hoping with our partners to actually jumpstart a solar panel industry in Puerto Rico that could then serve as a hub for the entire Caribbean. Other things that are going on in the Superfund world this week is an interesting one. There was an argument in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in the General Electric challenge to the constitutionality of unilateral Section 106 administrative orders. That argument took place on Tuesday, and we'll see how that comes out. The big news of last year in Superfund jurisprudence was, of course, the Burlington Northern decision. It's been talked about a lot. In the last couple of minutes, let me just say that what was notable about the district court decision that the Supreme Court upheld was that it had this simplistic arithmetic to try and figure out what the correct apportioned share of 1 or 2 of the PRPs there was. And what the district court did was to come up with some fractions that represented these PRPs' putative responsibility in certain areas. How much of the site did they own in a percentage basis? How much of the time did they own that portion of the site? And how much of the wastes that were totally managed on the site were managed on that portion of the site? Came up with 3 fractions and multiplied them together and said, aha, that's my answer. I'll add a little fudge factor in case I'm wrong and bump it up a little bit. The trouble is the judge didn't apparently understand that if you multiply fractions together, they get smaller. And so I'll just leave you with this. The judge said take 19% of the geography times 45% of the time times 66% of the total amount of contaminants that were managed there, multiplied them together, came up with 6%. If you hypothesized for a moment that there was only one other PRP, the owner-operator, and you did the same kind of arithmetic, you would either come up with 81% for the owner-operator. If you take that 81% plus the 6% for the PRP that the judge was doing this for, you'd come up with a total of 87% when it really should be 100%. You could make some other assumptions, and you'd either end up with more than 100% or less than 100%. And depending on what assumptions you make, that's what would come out. The trouble is that the judge didn't realize that an apportionment needs to end up with 100% by definition. It may be that some or even all or a large part of the 100% is allocated to PRPs that don't exist, that are defunct, that are gone, that are impecunious. That's fine, that's an orphan share. But if you have a structure that leads to either more than 100% or less than 100%, it is fundamentally flawed. And I think as this goes forward and people start to actually be forced to apply this in the real world, that judges are going to be forcefully presented with that problem, and they're going to be encouraged to come up with a different way of calculating apportionment if that's what they're going to be doing at all. Thank you.
Well, this panel has done an amazing job hurrying up time or making time reverse in Phyllis's case somehow. So we wanted to save time for questions and get back on track. And I guess as the moderator, while you think of your great question, I'll take a prerogative and ask folks, really stealing a page from the next panel and perhaps setting it up on cross-cutting issues. There's a lot of problems you've heard of today: air, water, greenhouse gas, energy. How do we reconcile it all? And I guess where I'm going with this is we seem to be in a world, in the last 40 years certainly, there's no longer a question of what needs to be done, or do we want to, or can we do it, but it's a question of can we afford to do it? And resources are the limiting question in so many ways, not just in these times of straightened municipal, state, and federal budgets. So I guess the question is, when we're trying to reconcile these regulations, what is the guiding principle? Is it environmental footprint, water footprint, greenhouse gas, and carbon footprint, or is it, bear with me for a second, is it cost benefit or benefit cost? Cost benefit obviously was achieved a taint, but some people, most notably Dean Revesz at NYU, have tried to take that back. He created the NYU Institute for Public Integrity, which has tried to pull in some public health impacts. So what's our guiding principle? And I'll start, I guess, with you, Jim.
Our guiding principle is water comes first. No, it's a great question, because I won't have a clean answer for it, but we did a study for just in New York what we need for drinking water infrastructure, and then just in New York what we need for wastewater infrastructure over the next 20 years. And one was by State Department of Health, one was by DEC, and it came to $36 billion for wastewater, $38 billion for drinking water. Those are very conservative numbers. Those are probably New York City's numbers, not alone putting aside the rest of the state, quite possibly, and what they actually would need to maintain these systems. So New York City is pretty costly. So that gives you some sense of the cost figures, and then you go around the state and you look at the shape that municipalities are in. Very difficult. And what it kind of means is we have a national infrastructure crisis. We have to, the same needs that can be expressed on how we have to rebuild our electric grid and maybe have a smart grid. Fix it first and fix our water and sewer lines. Transportation, intermodal transportation, and you ride the Amtrak train down here and you limp along. Sometimes you stop. In the winter it freezes up, and some days it runs perfectly fine. But that may be what we fundamentally have, Carter, is a national infrastructure crisis. And somehow we're going to have to figure out a way to address it in an economically efficient manner. The workload is gigantic, and it will put communities under unless there's some other way of getting on that, from an infrastructure bank to air and the like. And just to give you one sense of it, we got this enormous amount of money last year and wastewater from ERA. In New York State alone, $432 million, the biggest check EPA ever handed to an entity, twice what California got, and California was the number 2. $432 million. Our needs annually are easily in the $2 billion plus range. So that's the high watermark of federal funding, and it doesn't get us nearly where we need to be.
There certainly needs to be money, I guess, to refine the question a little bit. If we had a pile of $36 billion right here in the table, you know, and how would we spend it? Do we, at the end of the day, sum the total of lives saved if we spend it on air quality controls, greenhouse gas reductions, water, or is there some other measure that makes sense to you?
You asked earlier what about the cost-benefit analysis, is it dead, is it alive? I would be perfectly comfortable with using cost-benefit analysis if we could properly cost the costs and analyze them and cost the benefits. You know, the Corps of Engineers and BLM were great at that when they were building dams. They identified the construction costs, but not the eventual ecological costs. But they also have very creatively identified all the benefits that came from it, the recreational benefits and the agricultural benefits. They didn't particularly assign any ecological costs to balance those. I'm afraid that we probably haven't got a very good way to value the benefits of environmental cleanup. If you think of what the cancer panel said a week ago, it identified for the first time that really environmental threats are a major cause of cancers. It's sort of what we've probably assumed all along, but it is emphasized now by the presidential panel. If you really had no choice but to make this choice among how do you take $36 billion and allocate it, I'd say probably the infrastructure is the nearest thing that's necessary, and greenhouse gas emissions reductions is the most important thing that's necessary. I think policies could easily change how the greenhouse gas, how our international and national available resources are invested. I think green energy could be done that way just by changes of policy. It doesn't require a lot of application of money. I think infrastructure requires a lot of application of tax dollars.
Great, Guy.
Actually, the good news in terms of solid waste and especially in recycling is that it's been shown that for every dollar that's spent on recycling and infrastructure, that 94 cents of that is actually spent by the private sector. So I think in terms of government's best action, it is establishing the policies that will drive the investment. Of course, the bad news is I don't know that anybody's loaning anybody any money right now to make those investments, but hopefully that'll turn around.
Thank you. Phyllis?
I'd have to go with Jim. I am concerned about the infrastructure. I think that it's a failing of the federal government, and I'm coming just from my little universe, that we're asking small and large cities nationwide to go in and redo their sewage treatment systems, and we're asking them to do it without any help from the federal government. Jim spoke about the cost to us. We go, what about the cost? Can you imagine if we told New York City to put in separate storm and sewage systems? We would have a 30-year construction project that would probably cost over $1 trillion, and there would be no federal assistance. But yeah, I
did the math myself, and just it'd be, if you apply the Oswego rate per capita to New York City, it'd be $73 billion.
Oh, is that all? Well, then in that case, we're good. That's just like a drop in the bucket.
Do you live in New York City? You pay taxes?
I live in northern New Jersey. Ask me how I feel about that. I'm concerned about safe drinking water and swimmable, fishable water, and it goes to infrastructure.
Anyone? I think we will take, since our last speaker went over, the preceding us, we'll cut into the break and take 7 minutes or so for questions. Steve Browdigan.
Yeah, it's a question for Guy, and a recycling-related question. New York City, as you may know, has an extensive recycling law, and we're looking now to broaden that. One of the problematic fractions of the designated recyclables in New York City is glass. Early on in the current mayor's administration, we dropped the recycling of glass for financial reasons. We were getting about $5 a ton for the remaining metal and plastic that we were giving to the processor, and we processed paper separately, which also brought in some money. When we put glass back in after a hue and cry,
the economics totally switched, and we had to pay the processor $51 a ton. And a lot of people don't understand that much of that, or most of that glass, doesn't actually get turned into glass again. It gets other uses. Is New Jersey able to do any better, and what are your plans and thoughts in that regard?
No, we're not able to do any better. And we use our glass, a lot of the glass goes into alternate daily cover. Some does go into glass fall production. It's a problem, especially in New Jersey. We've seen a trend the last couple of years with more and more communities going a single stream approach, where all the bottles, cans, glass containers and that are commingled in with paper to make it more convenient on the homeowner level. But the mills that ultimately have to deal with the paper still have an enormous problem in terms of there being glass in there, and that just wreaks havoc in a paper making mode. One county has actually suggested maybe they would stop collecting glass, but try to substitute it with something else that would make up the difference in terms of the overall weight. So we don't really have an answer. It's an issue there too.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I have a question on the Marcellus Shale. If we start to build those wells, what would that do to your estimates of treating water, estimates for infrastructure for treating water in your
They'd have to find some place to bring it. And, treating Marcellus Shale frac fluid in water. We don't know exactly how much, but for one frac well, it's about 5 million gallons of water. I don't know if we're going to allow it necessarily to go to a wastewater treatment plant, because it's a question that's under debate, an active debate, and where it goes and how the people who put chemicals in the water, what they put in the water, and how it has to be treated are detailed regulatory matters. You can't bring frac fluid to a wastewater treatment plant in New York and have it treated right now. You have to go through an entire analysis known as an industrial pretreatment or headworks analysis. We have guidance out there and on exactly how this could be done, and how we've alerted all the wastewater treatment plants that you can't take this stuff until you know exactly how to handle those pollutants. So I just want to say we don't know exactly how much would be produced, but if you look down in Pennsylvania, they have a lot of wells. But they're finding that a lot of the frac fluid that they're injecting and smashing up the rock formations with is staying in the ground thus far, not coming back up through the well. Only about 7% is approximately the number that I'm hearing. Yeah, it concerns me.
Okay, any other questions? Or are people desperate for their coffee?
Hi.
Okay, oh, sorry.
Secretary
Chris,
for Phyllis
yes.
and Jim, what do you see the role of state and local wetland laws in preserving what remaining wetlands we have in the region? And do you see that being a stronger program than what's right now at the federal program?
I'm sorry, I pressed the button too early. It's funny that there are only 2 states in the United States that have assumed the wetlands program. It's a possibility under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. One is Michigan. We were discussing that briefly. They had anticipated having to hand the program back to the federal EPA because of lack of funding. And the other is New Jersey. And the New Jersey program is substantially better than the federal program. For one thing, they were never impacted by Rapanos. For another thing, they have a 100-foot buffer where we have nothing. So a very strong wetlands program in New Jersey, and frankly, I'm concerned personally that they may not keep the program. I hope that someone can assure me that they will. Localities do have some wetlands laws, but they're only effective on a very limited level. And New York has interesting laws that are sometimes more protective and sometimes less protective. It's a definition of wetlands that's causing us a problem in New York. But generally, the federal laws are more stringent than the state laws. It doesn't matter because you need in New York to get a federal and a state permit. So you've got the protection. But New Jersey, I think, is a model for the nation, and we're very proud of it.
If I could just say one addition to that is that New Jersey is a model in part because of its integrated technology, and it has a very sophisticated mapping program, and actually habitat mapping program for threatened and endangered species to overlay on that. Devils and details in every permit, but as a programmatic matter, it's really assisted permittees and permit writers and the like to find out where they have wetlands on their property. I'll note New York City has a grant from the New York Department of State to map wetlands in New York City. The states, and maybe Jim will speak to this, the state, we all know the state's maps are woefully out of date. But digitizing those maps would be, I think, helpful in a function, dare I say, that the federal government could play in terms of technology transfer.
I think the Rapinos problem is a big one. And 34 states put in a brief on the other side of this with the 4, I guess, dissenting judges asking for Rapinos, for the Clean Water Act to stay the way it was. Now, it's a number of issues. Remember, you need a permit for a discharge of a pollutant from a point source to a water of the United States. So if you're not discharging into a water of the United States, you may not be a jurisdictional discharge under the Clean Water Act. That's frightening. So we have instances that have come up, and Phyllis didn't cover it, but I've seen other presentations where fairly significant pollutant discharges were found to be non-jurisdictional under the current regime post-Rapinos.
Jim, I didn't have time.
Oh, okay. No. And so
That wasn't a timely law.
and so beyond just destroying wetlands, it's actual pollutants of water, and whether or not the Clean Water Act covers it. And the pressure is downward, not upward. If you don't have a national floor that's high enough, then people are saying to me, what the heck are you doing? You're putting us at an economic disadvantage. The second thing is, in New York, we don't have wetlands law that covers everything that the federal law covers, not even close. A Class C stream can be filled in New York. It's not a it's not a protection under Article 15 against filling a Class C stream. You can put it in a culvert, all right, unless there's certain other protections that you can put in place. Our law covers wetlands generally 12.4 acres in size, 5 hectares and above. So all these smaller pocket wetlands that are incredibly useful for flood protection, infiltration, water supply, they can be deregulated unless Phyllis is successful in doing her 100-page analysis on a headwater in the New York City watershed. Okay, and so this is a very big hurdle. The state of New York is on record in supporting what was called the Clean Water Restoration Act. Now it has a new name, AQUA. We have been actively advocating in favor of it, and it's just something that would put back in place the rule book before Swank that was well accepted for 30 years and well implemented and ready to go. So that's where we'd like to get to.